Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining today. I am most pleased to be speaking to the IDDI and X-Talk nations. And I do want, we have a lot of material to cover, and I don't want to rush, but I do want to get to your questions at the end. So what are the DMCs' responsibilities? Patient protection, especially for safety, to have an objective panel independent of the sponsor, and that word independent is very important, to be reviewing the ongoing safety data. Stewardship is an important word. Stewardship means the ultimate responsibility, the fiducial responsibility. And whenever we ask, should the DMC do this or shouldn't we do this, the question is this stewardship or is it not? And you might think of a corporation. The sponsor is the officer of the corporation, and the DMC is the board of directors of the corporation, meaning the DMC has the ultimate fiducial responsibility in a corporation, the board of directors the fiducial responsibility to the shareholders, the DMC in a clinical trial the fiducial responsibility to the patients. And independence, as I say, is very important. There will be many challenges to independence. And we will have some questions about that as we go through. Now, we do not do adjudication on DMCs, although we may have at one time. DMCs do not typically do adjudication of efficacy endpoints. That's usually done by a separate committee. However, I will go now to the first DMC that we know of in the pharma industry. I was privileged to be the chair of that DMC. It was in 1988. A company at the time was called SmithKline in French, and they were in a clinical trial for cimetidine for stress ulcers. Cimetidine is known as Tagamet, at least in North America, but this was an IV form for patients coming into an emergency room with stress ulcers. It was a placebo-controlled trial, and the efficacy endpoint was the prevention of upper GI bleeding. So the DMC certainly had safety and efficacy responsibilities, but they were doing adjudication in this trial because the question of did the patient bleed or not, the patients were intubated, and there were different types of evidence of bleeding. Some tubes had to be removed earlier than SmithKline would have liked, and some independent panel had to decide did the patient bleed or not, a blinded panel, and that's what we were. But we also reviewed the safety data. So what has been established then? In 26 years. There should be a charter for the DMC. There should be no conflict of interest. There should be open and closed sessions. There should be a masking or a blinding policy for the committee, and somebody should keep the minutes. Well, that isn't a whole lot. So the motivation today and in my book is it is time to consider what are the best practices for a DMC. Industry trials are different from government-sponsored clinical trials in ways that many of you are probably aware. And there were books before and discussions before at meetings, but many of them dealt with the government-sponsored trial DMCs. No issues are strictly clinical or strictly statistical. All issues are scientific, is what we have learned. And unlike the final efficacy analysis, no decisions on safety are made strictly on the basis of statistics. Although we are looking at the statistical analysis of safety data, we make decisions on safety in other ways. So my book was published in March of 2009, and we're going to go through some of the highlights of that book today. So the overview is my emphasis of my talk is on safety data, and I'll explain why in a moment. We'll have an introduction. We'll talk about safety monitoring, statistical methods, biases and pitfalls, DMC decisions, and emerging issues. Now, why safety data? Why am I putting the emphasis on safety data? Well, efficacy is considered only at specific times in a clinical trial, and perhaps only at the end of the trial when the DMC is no longer involved. 85% of the data collected in a clinical trial are for safety, and 90% of the DMC operations are safety-oriented even when the DMC has efficacy responsibilities, such as in a planned interim analysis. Safety data are more subjective than efficacy data, and safety decisions are made in the absence of knowledge of efficacy, making risk-benefit thinking difficult. So there is a lot of art to safety monitoring as well as science. Now,